Leaders of NATO countries, partners and invited guests will gather in Washington, D.C. for the NATO summit from July 9th to 11th to discuss a range of issues facing the alliance. NATO leaders have invited Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to the meeting, and they expect the Ukraine war to dominate the agenda. Ukraine discussions will include the establishment of a long-term funding mechanism to support Ukraine to fight the Russian invasion, updating the recent policy that allowed NATO-donated weapons to be used against targets inside Russia to a more liberal policy, and determining what policies can be implemented to Trump-proof NATO to allow continued US support of the war, no matter who is president of the United States, to placate overly dramatic NATO leaders. While these topics hold significance and controversy, the question of Ukraine's NATO membership invitation will emerge as a sticking issue. French President Emmanuel Macron won a stunning victory in French parliamentary elections by prostrating himself before the Socialists, Greens, Communists and radical left of the National Popular Front, or NPF, political party in France. He needed the NPF to defeat his political arch-rival Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party from getting a majority in the French parliament. As a result, Macron is politically weakened by his Faustian bargain with NPF and with it his grand vision to reshape the European Union into his version of Gaullism. Despite his new reality, President Macron clings to the hope of remaining a relevant political force in France, the European Union and NATO, without being considered a political lame duck. So President Macron considers the Washington NATO summit as an opportunity to escape his domestic political troubles, go to Washington and take the world stage to demonstrate that he is still relevant. He has once again brought up the current issue of the Ukraine war and its potential NATO membership, but now he is displaying his anger by criticizing and chastising NATO members, including the United States and Germany, for their perceived barriers to Ukraine's membership. This is an attempt by Macron to appeal to Ukrainian war hardliners to rally around the French vision of Europe. The issue with Ukraine's membership goes beyond the obstacles of the United States and Germany. It also involves the rules and bylaws of NATO itself. NATO in particular requires the unanimous consent of all member countries to elevate an invited nation to full membership. Due to the fractured nature of the US Senate, it is doubtful that a Ukraine NATO membership resolution could pass the Senate without significant compromises by President Biden on US border security to get the two-thirds support of senators needed under the treaty ratification requirements of the US Constitution. Hungary, the Slovak Republic and most likely Turkey, like the United States and Germany, are unlikely to support Ukraine for NATO membership while it is at war with Russia. While it is at war, Germany publicly opposes Ukraine's membership. Despite the fact that Ukraine's state of war does not violate NATO bylaws, the German leadership has a valid point. A country that receives an invitation to join NATO may face border disputes, but they must pledge to resolve them peacefully. Despite the bylaws of NATO remaining silent on the open question of war, how does NATO invoke Article 5, the collective defense article at the core of its alliance's strength? NATO countries have some leeway in how they support Article 5, but a country that is already at war and receives NATO membership could be perceived as coercing other NATO members into a war that a membership decision has forced upon them. Also, NATO is a defense and security alliance, but allowing the membership of a country at war could be viewed as NATO using Article 5 as a de facto declaration of war that is outside of its mandate. If other NATO members refuse to send aid to Ukraine because they fear entanglement in a war, it could also undermine NATO's collective security guarantees. These questions alone mean that there will be significant opposition to Ukraine's membership as long as the war continues, and most likely even shortly after the war concludes. NATO membership normally requires a Membership Action Plan, or MAP, but that was waived for Ukraine in 2023 to clear a hurdle for an eventual membership invitation. The MAP waiver isn't the only issue with which Ukraine membership invitations must meet. In 1995, NATO established policies for its expansion into Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc countries, which included the following: a functioning democratic political system based on a market economy, the fair treatment of minority populations, a commitment to the peaceful resolution of conflicts, the ability and willingness to make a military contribution to NATO operations, and a commitment to democratic civil-military relations and institutional structures. Ukraine has open border disputes in the Donbass and Crimea, which are a result of the Russian invasion, and outside of fighting the war with Russia, it will not be able to contribute to NATO as it fends off the Russian invasion, at which point the only contribution it could make to NATO is by making the Ukraine war a NATO war. The earlier debate over expanding NATO's membership to a warring nation directly links to this risk. The other issue is that Ukraine suppressed the Hungarian-speaking population in Ukraine before the war, which was one of the discussion topics when Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban visited Ukraine last week. Since the start of the war, Ukraine has outlawed the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Ukraine has been operating under martial law since the 2022 invasion, and it has suspended habeas corpus. The Russian invasion prompted the implementation of all of these measures, which some may justify as necessary for security purposes, albeit with dubious logic. Supporters of Ukraine's war measures point out the United States' decision to intern Japanese and Japanese Americans following the Pearl Harbor attack. The US, with its robust legal system, justified this action as a wartime measure in a democracy. Thus, Ukraine's wartime measures are not unusual. The final issue is that Ukraine has suspended elections, and President Zelensky is still president even though his term expired in April 2024. The war has presented Ukraine with numerous challenges, and its self-defense decisions, while potentially justified, have left it unable to meet the minimum NATO membership requirements. This is in addition to all the complications of wartime membership applications and processes. All of these issues can guarantee that Ukraine will most likely not be able to gather a majority of members to approve its application, much less the unanimous consent that is required. This brings the question back to the hapless Emmanuel Macron and his German and US headline-grabbing accusations. Macron knows that he's politically damaged, and he no longer has anywhere near the same political influence he had prior to the French parliamentary elections. Going to Washington and making a stand on the Potomac River to try to escape his new reality will not change his lost fortunes. His global criticism of the US and Germany will not change this fact. It will only create another schism within the alliance over Ukraine war policy, ensuring he remains in the headlines for reasons other than his waning political fortunes.